The Loop. How one soldier fought the Battle of Khe Sanh 500 times.
Welcome back to Untold Vietnam Chronicles, where we dive into the most impossible and mind-bending stories from a conflict that defied everything we thought we knew about reality itself. Tonight, we're uncovering perhaps the strangest classified case in military history, a phenomenon so bizarre that it remained locked in the deepest Pentagon vaults for over 50 years. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories that challenge the very nature of time and space, like this video. If you want to discover how one American soldier became trapped in a temporal anomaly that forced him to relive the same 18-hour battle hundreds of times, while slowly transforming into the perfect killing machine, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with our global community of reality questioners. Now prepare yourself for the impossible, because tonight we're exploring the classified case files of Private Chen, the soldier who fought the Battle of Khe Sanh 500 times, retained memories from each loop, and gradually became something that was no longer entirely human. Chapter 1. The Battle That Never Ended. January 21, 1968. Firebase Khe Sanh, 6 miles from the North Vietnamese border. Private First Class Chen was beginning what should have been just another day in one of the most dangerous outposts in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese army had been building up forces around Khe Sanh for weeks, and everyone knew a major assault was imminent. Chen was a 19-year-old draftee from San Francisco's Chinatown, deployed to Vietnam just 4 months earlier. He was assigned to Alpha Company, 1st Battalion 26th Marines, the unit that would bear the brunt of what became known as the Siege of Khe Sanh. At 0530 hours on January 21, Chen was manning a perimeter observation post when the first North Vietnamese rockets began falling on the firebase. What followed was an 18-hour battle that would leave 47 Marines dead and 21 wounded, statistics that Chen would come to know by heart. But something extraordinary happened to Chen during that first battle. At exactly 20:37 hours, as he was treating a wounded Marine named Bobby Martinez, a North Vietnamese artillery round exploded directly overhead. The blast should have killed both men instantly. Instead, Chen experienced what he would later describe as temporal displacement, a sensation of being pulled backward through time, while retaining full consciousness and memory of events that had just occurred. At 0530 hours, the following morning, Chen found himself back in the same observation post, experiencing the same initial rocket attack that had begun the previous day's battle. But unlike everyone around him, Chen retained complete memories of the 18-hour battle that had apparently never happened. Chen initially assumed he was experiencing traumatic flashbacks or combat-induced hallucination, but as the day progressed, every event unfolded exactly as he remembered from the previous timeline: the same tactical decisions, the same casualty patterns, even the same conversations between individual Marines. When Bobby Martinez was wounded in exactly the same way at exactly the same time, Chen realized he wasn't experiencing flashbacks. He was reliving the entire battle with perfect foreknowledge of everything that was about to happen. Chapter 2. The Perfect Soldier's Evolution. During his second experience of the Battle of Khe Sanh, Chen attempted to use his foreknowledge to prevent casualties and change the outcome of the engagement. He tried to warn officers about incoming artillery strikes, repositioned Marines away from positions he knew would be hit, and attempted to coordinate defensive responses based on his knowledge of enemy tactics. But Chen discovered that his efforts to change events were largely ineffective. When he warned Lieutenant Morrison about an incoming mortar strike that would kill him at 0847 hours, Morrison dismissed Chen's warning as combat stress and remained in the position where he was killed at exactly. When Chen tried to reposition Marines away from a bunker he knew would be destroyed, his orders were countermanded by officers who had their own tactical plans. The bunker was destroyed at exactly the time Chen remembered, killing the same Marines in the same way. However, Chen found that he could make small changes that affected individual outcomes, without altering the overall pattern of events. He could save specific Marines by being in the right place, at the right time, but the total casualty count remained constant as other Marines died in their place. More importantly, Chen began to understand the tactical patterns and enemy capabilities. With unprecedented precision, he knew exactly when and where every enemy attack would come, the precise timing of artillery barrages,
and the optimal defensive responses for every situation. When the 18-hour battle ended with his temporal displacement back to row 530 hours, Chen had already begun transforming from an inexperienced draftee into something approaching a perfect soldier with supernatural tactical awareness. Chapter 3: The Knowledge Accumulation. As Chen experienced his third, fourth, and fifth iterations of the same battle, he began systematically gathering intelligence and developing capabilities that exceeded normal human limitation. Each loop provided opportunities to observe enemy positions, study tactical patterns, and perfect combat techniques. Chen realized that he could use each loop to explore different aspects of the battle without consequence. He could take extreme risks to gather intelligence, knowing that any injuries or deaths would be reset when the loop restarted. This allowed him to conduct reconnaissance that would be suicidal for normal soldiers. During his seventh loop, Chen spent the entire 18 hours studying enemy positions and tactics. Instead of participating in defensive operations, he mapped every North Vietnamese firing position, documented their communication patterns, and analyzed their command structure with scientific precision. By his 15th loop, Chen had developed detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities that exceeded anything available to Marine intelligence officers. He knew the names of North Vietnamese commanders, understood their tactical preferences, and could predict their responses to any American defensive action. But Chen also began developing personal combat capabilities that approached superhuman level. With perfect foreknowledge of every engagement, he could position himself optimally for every firefight, anticipate every enemy movement, and execute tactical responses with machine-like precision. During his 21st loop, Chen achieved what he later described as perfect combat efficiency, eliminating 47 enemy soldiers while suffering 0 friendly casualties among Marines under his direct influence. He had become a one-man tactical computer capable of optimizing battlefield performance through temporal knowledge.
However, each loop also brought psychological challenges, as Chen experienced the same traumatic events repeatedly, while watching the same Marines die over and over again despite his efforts to save them. Chapter 4: The Psychological Breaking Point. By his 50th iteration of the Battle of Khe Sanh, Chen was experiencing severe psychological effects from repeatedly witnessing the deaths of Marines he had come to know intimately. The temporal loops had given him deep personal knowledge of every Marine in the unit, but he was forced to watch them die repeatedly while being unable to save them permanently. Chen began experiencing what military psychologists would later classify as temporal combat stress, a unique form of trauma caused by experiencing the same horrific events multiple times while retaining memories of each iteration. The psychological pressure was compounded by Chen's growing isolation from normal human experience. While other Marines lived through the battle only once, Chen accumulated hundreds of hours of combat experience in what appeared to them to be a single day. Chen's personality began changing as his accumulated knowledge and trauma created psychological adaptations that moved him beyond normal human emotional responses. He developed an analytical detachment from violence and death that allowed him to function effectively despite repeated exposure to extreme trauma. But this emotional numbing came with costs. Chen began viewing other Marines as tactical assets rather than human beings, calculating their utility and expendability with cold mathematical precision. His perfect knowledge of their fates made it difficult to maintain emotional connections with people he knew would die repeatedly. During his 63rd loop, Chen conducted an experiment where he deliberately allowed certain Marines to die in order to test different tactical approaches. This represented a fundamental shift in his psychology from protector to experimenter, treating human lives as variables in tactical calculations. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Each loop made Chen more tactically capable while making him less psychologically human. Chapter 5: The Temporal Strategist. As Chen's loop count exceeded 100 iterations, he began developing strategic capabilities that transcended normal military thinking. His perfect knowledge of battle patterns allowed him to experiment with increasingly sophisticated tactical innovations that tested the limits of what was possible within the temporal constraints. Chen discovered that while he couldn't change the overall outcome of the battle, he could manipulate specific events to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities, test experimental tactics, and develop combat techniques that exceeded conventional military doctrine. During Loop 2027,
Chen conducted a systematic analysis of North Vietnamese psychological responses to different tactical approaches. He tested how enemy forces reacted to various forms of psychological warfare, disinformation, and tactical deception. By Loop 156, Chen had developed techniques for manipulating enemy decision-making through carefully orchestrated tactical displays that influenced North Vietnamese commanders' strategic choices. He could essentially control enemy behavior by understanding their psychological patterns and decision-making processes. Chen also began experimenting with temporal manipulation techniques, testing whether his actions during loops could influence the parameters of the temporal anomaly itself. He discovered that extreme emotional or physical stress could sometimes extend the duration of loops or alter their reset conditions. Most remarkably, Chen found that he could create nested loops within the main temporal cycle, brief periods where time seemed to slow or repeat at shorter intervals, allowing him to perfect specific tactical sequences with supernatural precision. These nested loops gave Chen reaction times that approached precognitive levels. He could anticipate enemy actions with perfect accuracy and respond with mechanical precision that made him virtually invulnerable in combat. Chapter 6. The Machine Mind. By Loop 200, Chen's psychological transformation was complete. He had evolved from a frightened teenager into something that could only be described as a human tactical computer. His mind processed battlefield information with machine-like efficiency, while his emotional responses had been systematically eliminated through repeated trauma exposure. Chen's combat performance had reached levels that exceeded normal human capability. He could engage multiple targets simultaneously while coordinating defensive operations across the entire base. His knowledge of enemy patterns allowed him to predict and counter attacks before they began. But perhaps most remarkably, Chen had developed the ability to manipulate other Marines' behavior through precise psychological techniques. His perfect knowledge of their personalities and decision-making patterns allowed him to influence their actions with subtle suggestions and tactical instruction. During Loop 2034, Chen demonstrated his ability to coordinate the entire Marine defense through indirect influence, essentially controlling the battle without revealing his supernatural knowledge. He had become a puppet master, manipulating events from behind the scene. Chen's tactical innovations during this period included techniques that wouldn't be developed by conventional military science for decades. He created early warning systems using available materials, developed improvised weapons that exceeded standard military equipment effectiveness, and designed tactical procedures that optimized human performance under combat stress. Most importantly, Chen had learned to weaponize the temporal loops themselves. He could deliberately trigger specific events that would cause particular outcomes, essentially using his foreknowledge as a strategic weapon against enemy forces. By Loop 2050, Chen was no longer fighting the Battle of Khe Sanh. He was conducting a complex temporal experiment using warfare as his laboratory. Chapter 7. The Perfect Battle. Loop 2067 represented Chen's attempt to achieve what he called perfect tactical execution, conducting the 18-hour battle with optimal efficiency while minimizing friendly casualties and maximizing enemy losses. Using knowledge accumulated from 26 previous iterations, Chen orchestrated a defensive operation that approached tactical perfection. He positioned Marines at optimal locations, coordinated artillery support with supernatural precision, and executed counterattacks that devastated North Vietnamese forces. The result was a version of the Battle of Khe Sanh where American casualties were reduced to 3 killed and 12 wounded, while enemy losses exceeded 400 killed and wounded. Chen had achieved tactical success that exceeded anything in conventional military experience.
With this perfect battle came at a psychological cost that Chen hadn't anticipated. His manipulation of events required him to treat fellow Marines as tactical assets rather than human beings, calculating their lives with cold mathematical precision. Chen realized that achieving tactical perfection had completed his transformation from human soldier to tactical machine. He had gained the ability to conduct perfect warfare while losing his capacity for normal human emotion and connection. The perfect battle also revealed the limitations of Chen's temporal situation. Despite his tactical mastery, he remained trapped in the same 18-hour cycle, unable to escape the temporal anomaly. that had created his abilities. Chen began to understand that his perfect knowledge and tactical capabilities were symptoms of imprisonment rather than empowerment. He had become the perfect soldier by sacrificing everything that made him human. Chapter 8: The Temporal Resistance. Beginning with Loop 300, Chen began experimenting with techniques for breaking the temporal cycle that held him trapped. His accumulated knowledge of the anomaly's parameters suggested that it might be vulnerable to specific types of disruption. Chen's analysis indicated that the temporal loop was maintained by quantum entanglement effects, triggered by the explosion that had initiated his displacement. Breaking the entanglement would require recreating the exact conditions that had created the anomaly, while introducing controlled variables that could disrupt the temporal field. This required Chen to orchestrate events during the battle that would position him at the precise location where the original displacement had occurred, while creating conditions that could potentially break the temporal lock. Chen's efforts involved manipulating the entire battle to create specific tactical situations that would place the necessary personnel and equipment in optimal positions for his escape attempt. This required coordination so complex that it pushed even Chen's enhanced capabilities to their limits. During Loop 334, Chen's first attempt to break the temporal cycle resulted in a partial disruption that extended the loop duration to 22 hours, while introducing new variables that he hadn't experienced before. The expanded timeline provided additional opportunities, but also increased the complexity of his situation. Chen realized that escaping the temporal prison would require sacrificing the tactical advantages that his situation had provided. Breaking free meant giving up his perfect knowledge and returning to normal human limitations. The psychological conflict between the power of perfect knowledge and the desire for freedom created internal tension that challenged Chen's machine-like emotional control. Chapter 9: The Human Cost. As Chen's loop count approached 400 iterations, he began experiencing temporal degradation effects that threatened both his sanity and his tactical capability. The accumulated psychological trauma of experiencing the same battle hundreds of times was creating mental instabilities that affected his performance. Chen began having difficulties distinguishing between different iterations of the loop, as his memories of hundreds of similar events began merging into a confused temporal mass. He would sometimes respond to events that hadn't happened yet, or fail to react to situations that he had experienced countless times. More troubling, Chen began experiencing temporal bleeding, where memories from different loops would intrude into his current experience, creating confusion about which iteration he was currently experiencing. The psychological isolation was becoming unbearable. Chen had shared intensive experiences with thousands of versions of the same Marines, but none of them retained memories of these relationships. He was surrounded by friends who had no memory of their friendship. Chen also began experiencing physical symptoms of temporal displacement, including chronic fatigue, coordination problems, and sensory distortions that suggested his brain was struggling to process the enormous amount of accumulated sensory data. During Loop 329, Chen experienced a complete psychological breakdown that left him temporarily catatonic and unable to function tactically. The machine-like efficiency that had defined his existence for hundreds of loops was overwhelmed by human emotional needs that had been suppressed, but not eliminated. This breakdown forced Chen to confront the reality that his transformation into a perfect tactical machine had come at the cost of his humanity, and that continued exposure to temporal displacement was destroying whatever remained of his original personality. Chapter 10: The Escape Attempt. Loop 45 marked Chen's most sophisticated attempt to break free from the temporal prison that had created and trapped him. Using knowledge accumulated from over 400 iterations, Chen orchestrated a complex sequence of events designed to recreate and disrupt the quantum conditions that maintained the temporal loop. The escape attempt required Chen to manipulate the entire battle with unprecedented precision, positioning Marines and equipment according to calculations
that he had developed through hundreds of loops of experimentation and observation. Chen's plan involved deliberately triggering the same explosion that had caused his original displacement, but under controlled conditions that would disrupt the quantum entanglement, maintaining the temporal field. The calculations required to achieve this were so complex that they pushed Chen's enhanced mental capabilities to their absolute limits. The execution required perfect timing across multiple tactical operations that had to be coordinated to the second. Chen had to orchestrate artillery strikes, troop movements, and enemy actions to create the precise conditions necessary for temporal field disruption. At 20:37 hours, the exact time of Chen's original displacement, he positioned himself at ground zero of the explosion that had trapped him while introducing the calculated variables that his theoretical analysis suggested could break the temporal lock. The resulting explosion was identical to the original displacement event, but Chen's interventions created quantum interference patterns that destabilized the temporal field, maintaining the loop. For the first time in 45 iterations, Chen experienced something different. Instead of being displaced back to 0530 hours, he felt the temporal field fracturing around him as reality itself seemed to unravel and reconstruct. Chapter 11. The Fractured Timeline. Chen's escape attempt partially succeeded, but instead of returning him to normal time, it shattered the temporal loop into multiple overlapping fragments that created an even more complex situation. Chen found himself experiencing multiple versions of the Battle of Khe Sanh simultaneously, with conscious awareness spanning several different timeline fragments that were occurring at the same time. He could perceive events happening in parallel realities, where different tactical decisions had led to different outcomes.
In one fragment, Chen was reliving Loop 56, where he had achieved near-perfect tactical coordination. In another, he was experiencing Loop 28, where he had focused on gathering intelligence about enemy capabilities. A third fragment showed him the original loop, where he was still an inexperienced draftee, trying to understand what was happening to him. The multiple timeline awareness provided Chen with even greater tactical capabilities, as he could simultaneously access knowledge from all versions of his experience, while coordinating actions across different reality fragments. But the psychological strain of maintaining consciousness across multiple timelines was enormous. Chen's mind was stretched across different versions of reality, each with their own memories, experiences, and emotional associations. Chen realized that his escape attempt had not freed him from temporal imprisonment. It had made his situation infinitely more complex by trapping him in multiple overlapping loops that existed simultaneously. The fractured timeline also began affecting other Marines, who started experiencing brief glimpses of alternative versions of events and began showing signs of temporal displacement awareness. Chapter 12. The Final Loop. Loop 500 marked Chen's ultimate confrontation with the temporal anomaly that had defined his existence for what felt like years, but had occurred within a single 18-hour period of real time. Chen had discovered that the temporal fragmentation was spreading beyond his personal experience and beginning to affect the entire Phi base. Other Marines were starting to experience temporal displacement symptoms, and the fabric of reality around Khe Sanh was becoming increasingly unstable. Chen realized that his continued attempts to manipulate and escape the temporal anomaly were threatening to create a larger temporal catastrophe that could affect the entire region. The quantum entanglement that trapped him was connected to larger space-time structures that could be permanently damaged by further disruption attempts. Faced with the choice between personal freedom and preventing temporal catastrophe, Chen made the decision that completed his transformation from human soldier to something greater. He chose to stabilize the temporal anomaly by accepting permanent imprisonment within the loop structure. Chen's final action was to reverse the quantum interference that he had created during his escape attempts, essentially repairing the temporal field by sacrificing his own chance for freedom. But instead of simply returning to the original single loop,
Chen's intervention created what he called a temporal lock, where he would experience the battle only once more before being released back to tonal time at 20:37 hours on loop 500, as the same explosion that had started his displacement occurred for the final time. Chen felt the temporal field stabilizing around him as his consciousness was finally released from the quantum entanglement that had held him prisoner. Epilogue: The perfect soldier's return. When Chen emerged from the temporal anomaly after loop 500, only 18 hours had passed in real time, despite his subjective experience of months in temporal displacement to everyone else. The Battle of Khe Sanh had occurred normally, but Chen retained memories and capabilities from 500 iterations of the same combat experience. Chen's tactical knowledge and combat skills had been enhanced to levels that exceeded anything in normal military experience. He possessed perfect knowledge of small unit tactics, enemy behavior patterns, and battlefield psychology that made him extraordinarily effective in subsequent combat operations. But Chen also suffered from what military psychologists classified as temporal combat stress disorder, psychological trauma caused by experiencing repeated violent deaths and extreme combat situations while retaining memories from each iteration. Chen's personality had been fundamentally changed by his temporal experience. He displayed emotional detachment, machine-like tactical thinking, and psychological adaptations that made him an extraordinarily effective soldier, while creating challenges for normal social interaction. Military intelligence debriefed Chen extensively about his experience, but classified his case at the highest levels due to its implications for understanding time, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Chen continued serving in Vietnam with exceptional effectiveness, but he never again experienced temporal displacement effects. His one journey through 500 loops had been unique and unrepeatable. Today, Chen's case remains one of the most classified files in Pentagon archives. His experience challenged fundamental assumptions about time, memory, and human consciousness, while demonstrating capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Modern research into temporal anomalies and consciousness studies continues to investigate phenomena similar to Chen's experience, but no subsequent cases have achieved the same level of temporal displacement or knowledge accumulation. Chen himself rarely discusses his experience, describing it only as the longest day of my life that taught him everything about war and nothing about peace. His legacy proves that under extreme circumstances, human consciousness can transcend normal temporal limitations while revealing the psychological costs of experiencing reality from outside normal time. The Battle of Khe Sanh lasted 77 days for most participants. For Tommy Chen, it lasted 500 iterations of perfect tactical knowledge that transformed him from an inexperienced draftee into something that was no longer entirely human. His story reminds us that in war, the greatest victories sometimes come at costs that can't be measured in conventional terms. Chen won every battle by losing himself in the process, proving that perfect knowledge and perfect skill can be forms of imprisonment as well as empowerment. In the end, he learned everything there was to know about a single day of war, while forgetting what it meant to be human during peacetime.